Live from the Stability and Trim for the Ship's Officers podcast studio, where the vessel's its own best instrument of stability and trim. Welcome. This is William George. Hello. Today we're going to talk about free surface. This is podcast number 13, and this is from the Stability and Trim for the Ship's Officer, and we're starting with page 161, chapter 8. Prior to this chapter, the position of the center of gravity of the vessel, G, was considered to have a fixed and definite position, which could only be altered by changing the amount of weight or its location aboard the vessel. An example of this would be a bucket of water that was frozen. The solid mass of ice in the bucket would have a center of gravity that was fixed. However, if the ice in the bucket was allowed to thaw and turn to water, the bucket center of gravity will appear to rise, and that's when the bucket is inclined slightly. At various times in the previous chapters, free surface and free surface effects were mentioned, but not explained. Now is the time to investigate free surface effects. The free surface principles. The following principles should be kept in mind for both liquids and semi-liquids and dry bulk cargoes. The effect of free surface depends upon the dimensions of the movable surface and the volume of displacement of the vessel. The effects of free surface depends on minor degree to the relationship between the specific gravity of the movable material in the ship that's free to flow and the specific gravity of the liquid in which the ship is floating. For example, molasses has a density of 1.4, fresh water has a density of 1. So if a ship is in fresh water loaded with slack tanks of molasses, we'll find that this will magnify the free surface effect. On the other hand, if the ship has oil in a tank, and the gravity of, say, diesel oil is 0.85, and the density of the water is seawater 1.025, the ratio of 0.85 divided by 1.025, you will find will diminish the free surface effect for that tank. The weight and vertical position of the movable material in the vessel have an effect on transverse stability, which is not associated with free surface effects at all. So if you have a partly filled tank, the weight of the water in the tank itself is treated as a solid weight, but the free surface effect, what we call it, is a virtual rise in the center of gravity, even though the weight is moving sideways, and I'll explain that soon. The breadth of the movable material, which almost wholly accounts for free surface effects, changes when inclined, depending on the height of the movable material in the space. So if it tops out and hits the overhead in the space, the free surface will be diminished. The degree of inclination and the breadth of the depth ratio of the space will be taken into effect. And this is where you talk about pocketing. So let's talk a little bit more about free surface effects itself. It's a virtual rise. And on page 163, there's basically a sketch showing how the movable liquid is moving in figure 8-1. And what happens, it's just like a lift suspended weight. When you have a suspended weight and the weight is free to swing through an arc, the weight goes directly to the point of a suspension. Now in this case, the weight of the liquid in the tanks or in the flooded cargo hold is moving from side to side, but if you sketch it out, you're going to see that it's moving through an arc. The wedge of water that's actually moving is moving through an arc. It's not a flat move like a shift of cargo across the tank top. Because it's moving through an arc, the only place you can see where that liquid really is affecting is the radius of the center of that arc. So the flatter the arc will be caused by a wider space, and you'll get a greater virtual rise in the center of gravity. And a lot of people, they mimic the word virtual rise in the center of gravity, but they never really put it to a physical model. Okay, we've briefly talked about the effects of specific gravity. In the free surface formula, the basic formula is R times the length times the width of the tank or space cubed divided by 12 for a rectangular shape. That's a constant. It works for metric in English. And by the displaced volume. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. But this R factor is basically the ratio of the liquid, specific gravity of the liquid in the tank to that of the specific gravity of the liquid the vessel's floating in. And as I said, if the liquid in the tank is very dense, the free surface effect is magnified. If it's lighter than the water that the vessel's floating in, the free surface effect is diminished. So the effects of the amount of liquid in the tank, in theory, the free surface virtual rise, which is known as GG0, is RLB cubed divided by the displaced volume. And this works for metric as well as imperial units. If it's metric, the dimensions are in meters, and the virtual rise will be in meters, and the displacement will be in metric tons. For imperial units, the length and width of the space is in feet, the virtual rise will be in feet, and the displacement will be in long tons. So when we apply this free surface, it's a virtual rise. It can be added to the kg of the vessel or subtracted directly from the GM of the vessel. Just be careful you don't apply it twice or in the wrong direction. Free surface corrections. So the formula, like we said, is GG sub 0, or GGO, equals RLB cubed divided by the displaced volume. In imperial units, instead of 12 times 35 times the displacement in tons, you can simply use 420 times the displacement in tons, and that'll give you the displaced volume, because 420, as I've said before in previous podcasts, is the product of 12 times 35. This is on page 167. For metric units, again, what I said is GG sub 0 or GGO is the same formula, only the 12 is still there because that's for a rectangular tank shape or rectangular surface area. That's got to do with the moment of inertia of that shape. And on that page, we give examples of putting the numbers in the formulas and calculating the virtual rise. Anyway. And there's also on the next page an example in metric units. And so, free surface constants. Now, this is a confusing thing to some people. On the license exam, free surface constants are given in your stability book or as a given value for each tank. And it's basically RLB cubed divided by 12. And they leave out the displaced volume. So basically, in this calculation in imperial units, the naval architect will introduce the 35 in there, so it's really RLB cubed divided by 12 and 35 times, eventually times the displacement. But they hold the displacement out because it's easier to sum up the free surface corrections for all the tanks and then take these inertial moments of free surface or free surface constants and divide them by the final displacement. And there's examples given there. Also on page 171, we have a presentation of the free surface data and the methods of calculation. And on page 173, there's one example of it where you can see a graph where it shows the volume, and the volume at 0 is 0. The kg is a little bit higher than 0 because the kg is on the tank top usually, if it's a double bottom, a cargo hold maybe, or a double bottom tank, or a fuel tank that's not on the double bottom. And then you'll see this curve that's marked I, and that's the inertial moment of free surface. So if you know the sounding from the bottom of the tank, you can get the volume, you can get the kg, and you can get the free surface value from a graph like shown on page 173. Or they have tables, and if you look at the back of the book under the Stability Data Reference Guide, which I'll turn to very quickly, there's a liquid loading page, and that will show you the free surface moments for the different tanks. And that's in the appendix of the book. Moving right along, cross-connection valves for fuel tanks on small displacement vessels especially. The smaller the displacement, the larger the free surface correction. Now, when we talk about the procedures for deep tanks on a larger ship, if the tanks are carrying liquid and a free surface, the valve should be closed to reduce the free surface effect and prevent sluicing between the tanks. Sluicing is hydrostatic leveling. It's just gravitating from tank to tank. If the tanks are filled with liquid and they lie below the waterline, the valve may be open or closed. It doesn't matter. It's just immaterial. If the tanks are filled with liquid and they lie either partly or wholly above the waterline, the valve should be open. The reason, in case of a collision, the liquid will flow out of both tanks, causing a list to be prevented unless the valve is opened. So if the tanks on the deep tanks are above the water line, and they're filled, you can leave the cross-connection tank open, the valve open. If the tanks are empty, the valve should be open to automatically counterflood in case of damage. If the tanks are partly or fully loaded with dry cargo, the valve should be open, remembering that with most cargoes, a tremendous weight of water can get into the tank, even if it's filled with cargo. So that's the procedure for cross-connection valves. The other thing we're going to cover here, and that would be back on page 177, is the effects of pocketing, and we'll end it here today with this. And I will continue on with another section talking about sudden capsize syndrome and more about sluicing in mismanaged tanks. But that'll be the next podcast. So pocketing basically is when you get to about 20 degrees on your stability curve, the free surface effect is a virtual rise, so it's a sign correction. But basically around 20 degrees, what we do is we level the free surface effect off because of pocketing usually, so it's limited. And there's a section of overall effects of overall stability, and this is the discussion of free surface effects on the stability. And we talk about the idea of as the ship inclines, the surface dimensions change, and a wide, shallow tank can get very deep and narrow when you incline it to 45 degrees. So I might have two more podcasts about free surface. One about the sudden capsize syndrome, and the homework for today is I'd like everybody to know what is the tangent of 45 degrees, because the grain formulas for grain shifting use the tangent function for the assumed angle of the grain shift. But what happens is for liquids, there's an assumed angle of heel. And if you know the tangent of 45 degrees, you're going to find out why the tangent function disappears from the free surface formula. And that'll be probably, if this is podcast 13, 14, it'll be podcast 15 when I discuss it. And that's not in the book. And I look forward to all meeting with you again on the internet here, and thanks for listening.